All right, well, welcome to the Book of the Month video. This month we're going to be taking a look at the Constitution, and this video probably won't be very long. What I'd just like to do is go over some of the go through the Constitution. I'm not going to read it, but go through the different sections and different pieces and parts that make up the Constitution. The one thing that I think that we need to be very clear about is what the Constitution was trying to set up. The Constitution was not trying to set up necessarily a nation, so to speak. It was trying to set up a republic. And as I was reading through this, I was just reminded once again that what the founders were conceiving of was a republic of a bunch of states that were together in the United States, and how they wanted a lot of the authority and a lot of the different things that were going to be a part of what made up the United States to come from the states themselves. The idea of a federal government, we'll see this in some of the amendments, at least as we conceive of a federal government today, was not really what they had in mind. And so it was interesting to look at these and how they function and how they changed over time to become the system that we are obviously familiar with today. So, as you know, the preamble of the Constitution reads as follows. We the people, first famous three words, almost as famous as in the beginning from the Bible. We the people means that when the Constitution was put together, it wasn't a bunch of leaders, cramming this down on a new nation, but it was actually the people coming together to say, how can we have common interest? How can we serve each other's purpose? How can we, have rights and privileges and different pieces and parts to make our lives better? And the people of the United States at that time decided the best way we can do that is to form these things where we can make decisions and come together for common defense, and to be a part of the great system, the great experiment of freedom that the United States became. So their purpose was, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So, probably says it all. Here's the things that they wanted to see happen was justice, domestic tranquility, common defense, general welfare, which is something you could define in a lot of different ways, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to future generations. That's what they set out to do. And in order to do that, then they needed a way to govern. But one of the things that the founding fathers were very concerned about was they didn't want to fall out of the frying pan into the fire, which often happens in these kinds of things. They had just broken off in a very bloody conflict with Great Britain to establish the United States of America, or the so they declared independence from Great Britain, and they didn't want to get out from under the monarch to fall under a dictator. So they wanted to set up a system where, yes, we can make decisions, and yes, we can move forward, and yes, we can have common interests and common desires, and try to work on common goals and that kind of stuff, without giving an opportunity for a somebody with nefarious, or perhaps not nefarious, any kind of even very benevolent means to try to take over what they were trying to do, and dictate their will on everybody else when they don't have the consent of the people who are being governed. So they were very, very dedicated to all the voices being heard, which again you're going to hear as we kind of work our way through this document. And absolute masterclass in how to put together a system where we can grow, we can make decisions, we can have principles and guidance, without giving a system where somebody can come in and just dictate their will upon everybody. Because one thing the United States is very, very, has been very good at through the years, is not allowing one person to kind of call the shots. Even the president is not able to mandate his will on the people of the country. He certainly can steer it, and he certainly has influence over it, and that's it clear as day. But if there's something the president would ever want to do that is completely unpopular, there's plenty of checks and balances to make sure that doesn't happen. And we're going to talk about a few of those as we go through. So the very first thing that they wanted to set out in the Constitution then is, okay, so if we're going to create this body where decisions can be made, so what is it going to look like? And the very first section 1 says, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. So the governing body of the United States really is the Congress. And the Congress is made up of the two houses of government, which is, we know them today as the Senate and House of Representatives. And we're going to, the Constitution sets out how those things, how they're decided, how they function, what roles they provide. But they are really the decision-making body for the whole country. So as the states, ratified and joined the Union and joined what we know now as the United States, as those things happen, they would be able to put representatives in both the House of Representatives and the Senate to be able to make those decisions. So that's how it's going to be. You're going to have House of Representatives, you're going to have the Senate. So how do we decide who gets to be in those places? Section 2, the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. House of Representatives is obviously much larger than the Senate because the representation in the Senate is decided by population. So if each state, the state has more people, not more land size, more people, then they obviously get more representatives in the House of Representatives. So that's why today there's a lot more members, and I should have looked up the numbers. I don't have it right here in front of me. I'm not sure what the current number of House of Representatives is, but again, based on population. So the decisions made out of there are made based on representation from the more densely populated parts of our United States. So there's different qualifications, how old they have to be, and citizen, and so on and so forth. And then it lays out for what was the 12 original colonies at that time. There were 12 original states. How did they get their representatives, which is obviously very different today. There's instructions on how, should for some reason some elected person not be able to serve, and how we deal with that, those kind of things, and how the Speaker of the House is chosen. So our House of Representatives based on population. Section 3 then talks about how we establish the Senate. Now the Senate, every state gets 2. Doesn't matter if you've got a gazillion people or 3 people, you get 2 representatives from every state. So every state in the Union gets the same number of people, again, and the same number of representatives in the Senate, regardless of population size. And then there's a lot of qualifications for how they are put in there. The vice president is the president of the Senate. That person only votes if there's a tie. And obviously with a much smaller number, a tie is much more likely than it would be in the House of Representatives. Not that it couldn't happen there, but it'd be much more likely in the Senate. Now, the Senate, representing the different states in the Union rather than the population itself, like the House of Representatives, they hold special privileges and power, such as impeachment over the president, which we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Those are initiated in the Senate as represented by the states. So there's a few enumerated powers in there about what the Senate can do, so on and so forth. So, all right, Section 4 talks about when and how the senators and representatives can meet. Nothing earth-shattering there. Section 5 is then, let's see here, how each house kind of figures out who gets to be there. Any kind of disciplinary issues and those kind of things, the House is set up to deal with that, and how those things work. Hang on here, I got way too many papers I'm looking at. Okay, so all right. So I'm going to skip through some of this. Basically, it enumerates the powers and how they work. The next couple of sections. Section 6 says we have to pay them, which makes sense. Section 7 talks about how taxation and revenue generating, whether through tariffs or taxes, are going to happen. That happens in the House of Representatives. So that was one more that's the people have more control over, because the House of Representatives is made up of a group of folks, or made up of based on population, not just numbers from the state. Section 8 says a little more about how revenue can be put together, and then talks about what they can do with the money as far as government agencies and declaring war and different things that the government is able to do. Section 9 talks about some of the restrictions put on how funding is made. Uh, you know, you know, you have to have explained to you before you interact with the government. You have to have parameters of what that's going to mean. Um, and a lot of those kind of things kind of dictates how the United States government uh, interacts with its citizens. I guess that's the way to say it. Number 10, limit some of the rights of the states and different things they can do. Again, all parts of the privileges and limitations set on the House of Representatives and the Senate. Who gets to do what, who gets to decide what, and some specific things around that. And as you can imagine, been a lot of fights about that through the years. Article 2 of the Constitution is about the executive branch. So Article 1, again, dealing with legislative branch. I guess I should have said that earlier. Legislative branch, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, they get to legislate, means they get to decide what the laws are. Article 2 deals with the executive branch, which means, okay, so once the legislative branch decides what the laws are, then the executive branch gets to go forward and decide how those laws are to be applied in real life. And the executive branch is headed obviously by the president himself, and he is the chief executor of the rights and privileges given to by the people of the United States to their leaders. There's a lot of so Article 2 goes through a lot of explaining what the president can do and how a person becomes qualified to be president, so on and so forth. Article 3 then is the judicial branch. So we've got the legislative who makes the laws, the executive who carries out the laws, the judicial branch then gets to interpret the laws. And which, again, all three are necessary to be a part of what it is. So you got to decide what, and then how, and then explanation is essentially what the three parts do. And we'll talk about how these three branches kind of interact with each other here in a second. But the interesting thing about this is when you talk about making laws, executing laws, or judging or interpreting laws, which is what the three parts of the government do. Each part was set up with specific powers. The separation of powers you probably have heard of, which means you don't want anybody from the executive branch, making decisions about laws. You don't want anybody from the judicial branch, executing laws. You get to work in one field, and you don't want any one section of government taking over more than one role of government, because if that happens, the idea of dictatorship gets very, very likely. So that's why each of the three branches of government, the other two branches have ways that they specifically can do checks and balances over each one. So let me briefly go over those. So when you got the legislative branch, which is the branch that makes the laws, they check the executive branch by overriding vetoes, which means that the president vetoes something, the Congress can get together and override that veto. They also have impeachment power over the president, and they also approve any appointments such as Supreme Court justices and all that kind of stuff. And any treaties that the United States happens to enter into have to go through they are able to override that if they decide that they don't like it. So that's how the legislative branch checks the executive branch. How the legislative branch checks the judicial branch is the legislators get to confirm judges. And you may remember, whenever we get a new Supreme Court justice, they're nominated by the president, and then they have to go through the confirmation process, which is just an ugly affair, regardless of who's being nominated. But that's one of the powers they have, of the checks over the judicial system. The legislative branch gets to confirm all judges. If there's an impeachment of a judge, that comes from the legislative branch. And any amendments, and we're going to talk about amendments here in a second, any amendments also start in the legislative branch. Amendments are checks over the judicial system, because once the amendment is decided, okay, we're going to make this amendment, then the judicial branch gets to interpret what that amendment means. And so that's another form of checks and balances. The executive branch, then, that's the branch headed up by the president. They're the ones who carry out the laws. The executive branch has checks and balances over the legislative branch, because the president obviously can veto a bill. Anything the legislators say, hey, we'd like to do this, president like that, don't think so. So he can veto it. You could also call a special session of Congress to deal with any specific issues that happen to come up. So that's how the executive branch checks the legislative branch. How the executive branch checks the judicial branch is the executive branch, as I said a moment ago, they nominate all federal judges. Also, the president has the power of the pardon, which means if the judicial branch, does something that the president, that's been interpreted a lot of different ways. But whatever the judicial branch, if they want to hand out a judgment against somebody, the president can pardon them from that. So that's a check. That's one of the checks and balances that the executive branch has over the judicial branch. Now, the judicial branch has checks and balances over the legislative branch. By the judicial branch can take a look at a law, something that the legislators have put together. The legislators say, "Hey, here's a law that we think we should enact," and the judicial system can look at it and say, "I'm not. That's unconstitutional. It violates the Constitution in whatever way they see fit," and can put legislation null and void through that power. The judicial branch has checks over the executive branch by, again, if kind of the same way, where if there's an executive action where the president would say, I mean, a recent example is the president declared military action in Iraq, and and so then the judicial branch is able to declare that executive action unconstitutional, and then that sets up the checks and balances system, and then everybody has to interpret what that means once that declaration has been made. So that's how the branch is kind of set up. So the founding fathers set it up so that they would be able to keep each other in check. It's a fascinating system, honestly, set up to get in its own way. It is set up for chaos. It is set up for trying to slow things down, to make sure there's no hair trigger decisions or anything like that, which is a very interesting way to go about that, and to kind of keep things keep things so that nobody's able to usurp power, which was the number one concern that our founding fathers had. Now, to the Constitution and these three branches of government and the checks and balances that they hold over each other, over the years, a number of amendments have been proposed, and I'm going to go through these kind of quickly as we're finishing up here. The first 10 you probably heard of, called the Bill of Rights, and those were ratified in 1791, which would have been a 4 or 5 year, couple of years after the adoption of the original Constitution. The First Amendment is one you hear all the time: protection of speech, religion, and the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. Basically means you're allowed to say what you want, believe what you want, read what you want, and you have a right to address your government in peaceful ways, of course, but to be able to speak to them about issues and concerns that you have. The Second Amendment, most of you could probably say without me having to say it, is the right to keep and bear arms. That citizens are allowed to arm themselves and defend their country and defend their neighborhoods and their families and their property and all that kind of stuff. The Third Amendment, one that I don't, the Civil War, probably the only time this would have ever been a problem. The government is not allowed to shelter soldiers in your home. So I hope that's a relief to you. That's the Third Amendment. The Fourth Amendment says, you hear about this one on any cop shows that you watch on TV, the illegal search and seizures, which means you have to have a warrant from a judicial thing before the executive, police officers and agents like that are part of the executive branch. And in order for them to go in and enter your home to look for evidence or whatever, they have to have a warrant. The judicial system has to sign off on it, is basically what that says. The Fifth Amendment guarantees against double jeopardy, which means if I've tried you once and you were not convicted, I can't try you again for the same crime. Again, if you ever watch a cop show, you've heard of that one. Also, the Fifth Amendment says you don't have to incriminate yourself, which means if you're on the stand and somebody asks you questions, if it's a murder trial, they say, "Well, did you kill the person?" You don't have to answer that question because you can't. You are not able to incriminate yourself, supposedly, because of the Fifth Amendment. So that's what that is. The Sixth Amendment is another one you hear if you ever watch cop shows. Right to a speedy trial, which means they can't draw it out forever and ever. They have to move forward with all due haste. The Seventh Amendment is right to a jury trial, which means if you're either criminally charged or if you're civilly charged, means you're being sued by somebody, you have a right to a criminal, or I'm sorry, a jury trial which means the citizens, again, which is where the power of the Constitution originates from, are able to get together and decide what needs to happen. The Eighth Amendment means they cannot put excessive bail on you, which means if they, I don't know, arrest you for jaywalking, they can't give you a $10 million bail. They have to, make it be reasonable to what's going on. And also, the Eighth Amendment says no cruel and unusual punishment, which is a phrase you probably heard many times. The Ninth Amendment says, I guess I've never read this one before. The Ninth Amendment says the states that people have no other rights that are not expressly listed in the Constitution. Let me read that, make sure I got it right. People have other rights not expressly listed in the Constitution. I read that wrong. So basically, if I'm interpreting this correctly, it means if the Constitution doesn't say anything about it, then we assume you can do it. And if there's something out there, a good example is the Constitution. It's kind of a silly example, but there's nothing in the Constitution about whether or not it's legal to ride on an airplane, because there weren't any airplanes at that time. Now, obviously, it's perfectly legal for you to get on an airplane and fly wherever you want to go. But they put this in there to say the Constitution is the floor, not the ceiling. So it's the basis from where you start, and then everything beyond that we'll have to make decisions about as they come along. It's not to say that they didn't want the Constitution to be the end. They wanted it to be the beginning of the freedoms that we all enjoy. And the 10th Amendment states that any powers not given to the federal government belong to the states or to the people. Again, very clear in this document that the United States was set up to be a republic. Each of the individual states was to be where the power resided, and that's what they wanted to enforce as much as possible. So that was the first part of the Bill of Rights from 1791. For the next few years, there was what we'll call some tweaking that went on. The 11th Amendment limits the ability of individuals to sue the states in federal court. I'm assuming there's a story there. I didn't look up what it was, but if I have a grievance against the United States government, I can't just go sue the United States government. That is prohibited by the 11th Amendment. 12th Amendment fixes the Electoral College so that the president and vice president are voted on separate ballots. I don't mean to laugh. Originally, in the first couple, I think the first two, if I'm not mistaken, presidential elections. So the first one would be George Washington, next would be John Adams. In those two elections, the way it worked is you had two guys who were running, and what they do is they say, okay, here's the two guys. You can vote for one and the other, vote for whoever you want. They like this guy. Well, then this guy, his running, or the guy who's running against, becomes his vice president. And they decided that became a problem when there was a discrepancy early on, where two guys actually shot each other over this. Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, I believe, over a duel over the ballots, and so they said probably doing this is probably not the best way. And I'm trying to imagine if they hadn't changed this. Could you imagine some of our recent elections? I mean, the last election would be Donald Trump would be the president and Kamala Harris would have been the vice president under that system. That would have been some comedy gold right there. So anyways, but they said it's probably not good. So what it essentially did is it created running mates for the president, which means like in the last election, Donald Trump ran with J.D. Vance instead of, so he became the vice president along with him. So you're basically voting for two people now instead of one. And but that's what the 12th Amendment set up, because they decided. Could you imagine? You're the person you're running against becomes your vice president, which means if you get assassinated, that means they're the president. So that they're all kind of problems, and so they had to fix that one with the 12th Amendment. The 13th Amendment passed in 1865. You can probably guess what that one is: abolishing the blight of slavery, and you can no longer be forced into involuntary service unless you're being punished for a crime. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S., guarantees equal protection laws and due process at state levels. Basically, they were trying to raise freed slaves up to the status of freed people, which was, that's an amendment that needed to happen. Very proud that happened. What essentially happened, what was going on was, especially in the South, where there were a lot of freed slaves, is they were not recognized as fellow citizens. So the North basically said, you either fix this problem or we're going to fix it for you by, we will not recognize any of your electorates if you don't bring everybody up on an equal par. And the South said, well, we would really like to be represented in this republic we're being put back into after the Civil War. And so that at least on paper fixed some of the problems. Now, as we know, for 100 years after that, there were problems with civil unrest. But it was a step toward equality. The 15th Amendment then guarantees the right to vote to anyone of any race. And again, that was an aftermath of the Civil War. The 16th Amendment, passed in 1913, allowed the federal government to collect income tax. And given the date of that, I'm assuming that was in response to the First World War. And that's so that they needed some funding for that. So an income tax was put in, and don't look for that one to ever go away, but that's what they had. The 17th Amendment changes how the U.S. senators were elected. Previously, state legislators would be elected, and then the state legislators would get together and decide who the senators were who were going to go serve in the Senate. The 17th Amendment said no, they're now elected directly by the people. And I don't know what the story is around that one, but that was what was decided. So the House senators were elected remember, 2 per state, regardless of size. How they were elected went from the role of the state legislators to the people themselves. That's why today we vote for our senators. The 18th Amendment, kind of a famous one, prohibition. Alcohol was outlawed, and it was outlawed. It was until for about 12 years, 12, 13 years. Prohibition was enforced, which means the stories of Al Capone and things that you've heard, Elliot Ness and a whole bunch of them. What the problem with prohibition that they ran into was it created a black market for alcohol, which made gangsters like Al Capone just insanely rich, because people were still drinking drinking their alcohol, but they had to go to these gangsters and illegal sources, speakeasies, and all that kind of stuff to get it, which is why the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th. The 19th Amendment, 1920, gave women the right to vote, one you probably heard about many times. All right, the 20th Amendment changed Inauguration Day. Inauguration Day used to be, prior to 1933, was in March, and I'm assuming that was because of the limitations on travel back when the United States was being formed. So they needed time to get people that were elected into the places where they needed to be. But what that began to create with modern transportation was the president would be lame duck for a lot longer. Now we have our elections in November, and then the new president sworn in January. It's only, not quite 2 months. Or then it was almost 4 months, where you'd have a president voted out, but still president for 4 months. And they decided that was too long. So the 20th Amendment moved Inauguration Day back to January. Let's see. The 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. So, yeehaw, you can get drunk again. That's the 21st Amendment. 22nd Amendment limited the number of terms a president could serve. I'm assuming that's because, I'm not assuming, I know it's because FDR served 4 terms and they decided that was too many. So they limited it down to 2 terms. The 23rd Amendment, I didn't know this, gave Washington, D.C. residents the right to vote for president by granting them electoral college electors. So the people apparently in Washington, can't say for certain. I don't know if maybe they were not allowed to vote prior to that. I'm not sure. They didn't want the politicians voting for other politicians. I guess I can see why they would think that. But anyways, so 1961 gave Washington, D.C. residents the right to vote. Let's see. The 24th Amendment was passed in 1964, banned poll taxes, charging people money to vote, which is what a poll tax is. It was used in the South specifically to keep black citizens from voting. Again, this was passed in 1964. We're 99 years now after the Civil War, and still dealing with some of these issues. The 25th Amendment was passed in 1967. It basically outlined, and this is in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, as to how the vice president takes over if something happens to the president. Again, God forbid, assassination or health issue, or if he's going in for surgery or going to be put under general anesthesia, anything like that. How what's the process of swearing the vice president in and then transferring powers back to the rightfully elected president? So just some clarification around that. The 26th Amendment, in response to the Vietnam War, lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. The reason for that was they were drafting 18-year-olds and up to go fight in Vietnam, which means they could go fight in a war, but they weren't allowed to vote. That was seen to be ridiculous, probably because it is ridiculous. And so that's why 18-year-olds are now allowed to vote. That was 1971. And then in 1992, a very strange amendment, and I actually have a connection to this one, states that if Congress votes itself a pay raise, that pay raise does not take effect until the next term in Congress. So essentially, if you're going to vote for a pay raise, you might not get it if you get voted out, is essentially how that works. Now, interesting thing about that, it was passed in 1992. It was proposed originally by James Madison and was originally thought to be considered to be one of the original Bill of Rights, of the 10 Bill of Rights. This was one of them that James Madison put in there. It did not get popular support, so it was just taken out, and then they approved the other 10, and then they went with it. So Bill of Rights would have had 11, I guess, had this one been included. So it was taken out. They voted in the Bill of Rights, but the amendment had been approved by a couple of electorates. Now, not enough to turn it into an amendment, but it had been approved by a couple of electors along the way. So it's still alive. Well, what happened is in the mid to 80s, there was a man, let me get his name here. His name was Gregory Watson. And Gregory Watson was in a government class. He's a doctor today, but he was in a government class at the time. And he was writing a term paper for this government class he was in. And he found out about this amendment, proposed by James Madison that said if you vote for a pay raise, it doesn't take effect till the next term of Congress. And he wrote his paper about how this amendment was still technically tabled. It still existed. And so he wrote this paper and he did some research about it and what happened to it, so on and so forth. Well, he turned the paper in and he got a C on it. And he was a little perturbed about that. So he went to plead his case to the professor. The professor apparently was unwavered by that, didn't change the grade. So he went on a letter writing campaign to have this amendment approved. And so he did all this stuff. And in the time in the mid to late 80s, there was a lot of frustration with the government and how things were running. So it started to gain a little traction and eventually was approved. And it was approved by Congress through this letter writing campaign started by this one guy who was mad about a grade he got on this government paper. Now, my connection to this is as I said, it was approved in early May of 1992. I was actually in the halls of government. I was in Congress the day this was approved. I was in the building, and I was there on a senior trip. And I can remember we were kind of touring the halls and we were going around with the tour guide. And all of a sudden there was a big cheer came out of the hall where all the congressmen were. And this big cheer come up and, no big deal. Well, we found out later that day that this amendment had been approved that day I was there. So I was in the building when this thing happened and was a part of that. And it's interesting. It took, 200 years almost for this thing sat around and ended up being approved. It's a funny story that in 2017, then, almost 30 years after this letter writing campaign, the college went back and updated what was his name, Gregory Watson's paper to an A. Clearly he deserved it. So kind of a fascinating story, but I was in the building the day it happened, and maybe my big claim to fame. So anyway, all right. I said this was going to be short. I totally lied about that. Thank you if you're still watching and for my quick rundown of the Constitution and how all these things work. We live in a great country. I hope you've got to have some barbecue and enjoyed a celebration for America's 250th birthday. And appreciate all of you who are part of the Book of the Month Club. Thank you for watching. And, of course, may God bless America.